It is so late at night, and you are walking alone on the street, enjoying the briskness of the air, and the soft light of the moon on your footsteps is when you suddenly a shadow in the distance. You look over and don't see what it is. Eventually it turns out to be a shape of the man, and as you approach him casually, you let out a sigh of relief. You nod your head politely and give them a quick smile. But when you turn back once again, you realize that he, or whatever it is headless. Grab a blanket, turn off your lights for these true scary ghost stories while walking alone at night. The Green Man. I've been contemplating posting this story for a while now, but I need to get it out, so here it goes. I grew up in semi-rural country, and my house was situated on a 1-acre plot of land. On either side of my yard was forest, with my house right in the middle. So from the backyard, I could see out past either side of the house to the road. It was summertime, and I was about 9 years old then. My dad, mom, and younger brother were outside with me one night, working on a project for a science fair presentation for the upcoming school year. I guess it was about 9 at night, and we were happily working and laughing together, enjoying the warm summer air and the peace and quiet that comes with living in a rural town. It couldn't have been a more relaxing night. Then, I looked up towards the dark road for a second and froze. There, by the street, walking towards us along the edge of the woods, was what looked like a man. He was dressed in a long black coat, and I couldn't see his hands or feet. But the color of his clothing was the last thing on my mind. It was his head that held my gaze because it was glowing fiercely, with a bright green color like there was an electric light under his skin. He had no hair at all, and his head and face were emanating this weird sickly light as he slowly made his way towards me and my family. Then, I looked away and walked as calmly as I possibly could back inside. To this day, I don't know why I didn't warn anyone or say anything, but maybe like a kid who hides under the bed, I just thought that I could will it gone. And maybe that's what happened. It was years before I told any of my family about what I saw, and they never brought it up either. They didn't believe me at first, and I realized they never saw it. None of them. As an adult, I still think about that night. And even now, when I'm back at my parents' house at night, I can't help but look at the spot where I saw the Green Man. He's never returned. I'm not proposing any theories about who or what he was, but what still twists me up is that I can't come up with a rational explanation for what I saw. If it was a normal person, I can't think of a motive for walking alone at night towards a random family. I can't think of how or why his head was emanating so much light. And I absolutely can't think of why no one else saw him or where he went at all. If he was something else, well, I have even less of a clue. Any ideas? Why I never walk down the road I used to live on at night anymore. So before I decide to just jump into this, I figured I would give a little backstory that may or may not relate to that night. When I was only 2 years old, I lost both of my parents in Pennsylvania, so from a very young age, I had a full concept of death. As a kid, I was used to seeing black human-like figures out the corner of my vision, and as soon as I would glance over, it was always gone. So to begin with this night years later, we moved to Florida, and this road we lived on was exactly half a mile long. There were tall trees on either side of the road, so when it got dark out, well, to say the least, it was dark. The road had a small hill at the beginning, and right at the top, there were 2 houses and a street light. At the very end of the road was my house and 4 others, but between the street light and the end of the road, which was roughly 3/4 of that half-mile, was where the woods began. Now, there was no other street light on the street, except that one at the other end of the road. I used to have to walk to my bus stop for high school down this road. I mean, nothing weird ever really happened, but once. One time, looked down to light a smoke and noticed a person's shadow run under the light. This shadow was like any other person's shadow, flat on the ground. I never really thought much of it, until say 4 years later. That time I was maybe 17 though, and was headed out for a smoke before I went to bed. It was a hot summer night in Florida, and we had heat lightning. Between the ages of 13 and 17 were some of the hardest years of my life. I guess you could say my parents' passing sunk in through those years. Anyways, I was having a bad night, and my depression was pretty bad at this point. I had a time where I could smoke 1 cigarette walking down my road, and another while walking back. I began my walk how I always did, threw in some headphones, and started leaving my driveway. Once I got on the road, I lit up my first cigarette and began walking towards the streetlight. I was 1/5 of the way. There, I changed the song on my iPad, and when I looked up, I noticed something standing in the street. I distinctively saw 2 kinds of glowing red eyes, so my first instinct was to rub my eyes. I thought maybe my eyes were adjusting after changing the song in my iPod, right? This, however, was not the case. After I rubbed my eyes, I looked up and it was still there, and I went into a phase of like zoning out. I couldn't look away, and it was making eye contact with me. I was too scared, my body froze up, and I just could not look away. I couldn't move. I was just frozen there. It seemed like I was there for hours, but realistically it was probably only about 10 seconds. The heat lightning flashed, and this time, I saw the whole figure. It was roughly 500 feet away from me, but appeared to be roughly 6 feet tall, and looked shrouded. It appeared like steam was emitting off its body. The body itself was pitch black, but around it was like a black steam. The worst part was the moment the heat lightning wasn't lighting up the sky, and it was just like a horror movie. All you could see was the eyes, but it hadn't moved closer without actually moving. It just stood there, staring at me, and I couldn't move. After the first flash, its head appeared to be confused like a dog, slightly cocked to the side. The heat lightning flashed again. Its head went back straight and again moved about 15 feet closer. This happened 2 or 3 more times, and I just snapped out of it. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back to my house, never daring to turn around for fear it would be right behind me. Since that night, I have never walked down that road at night again. It has been maybe 7 years since that experience. Every year when I come home to visit my grandparents, I'll smoke in the driveway sometimes looking down the road. Every time I do though, my hair stand up on end and I get this gut feeling like I shouldn't go near it. Sometimes even when driving down this road, I get this gut feeling I should just stay away. BC Coastal Mountains. Don't know what I saw. My uncle owns a chalet about 15 kilometers outside of Whistler, right on a mountain, though I'm not sure what it's called. My family and I were up there this weekend because my reading week just started. Not last night, but the night before, my brother and I were behind the house in the hot tub around 8 o'clock. It was pretty cloudy and raining and snowing a bit, but you could still see a bit of the moon, which was giving us some light. Also, some light from the chalet itself was helping to light up the area around us a little bit. Anyways, my brother is facing me and I him when I notice something moving around a bit off in the distance. From what I could tell in the low lighting, it looked very slender and on all fours, about 3 feet tall at its back. At first I thought it was maybe a Great Dane, because I know the neighbors have a dog of some kind, so I brush it off. I can't stop looking at it though, because it just looks like it's sniffing the ground, and it's been there for like 5 to 10 minutes since I first noticed it. But then I noticed that its front legs aren't actually on the ground, but a few inches above the ground. Anyways, at this point it turns around and looks right at us. It has these glowing eyes that I could kind of make out the shape of its face, which was flat and definitely not canine. It gave us this wicked smile that I cannot shake, and then it stood on its back legs and started walking towards us. Its arms were very long, at least down to its knees, and it stood just over 6 feet tall on its back legs. Despite the fact that it was bipedal, I couldn't shake the idea that it seemed very animal-like. I could tell its hair was long when it stood up, but that was all. My brother and I booked it out of there and got into the chalet pretty quickly. We went back outside to turn off the hot tub and cover it up about half an hour later, and there was nothing there. Anyways, I was up late that night, and around 1 a.m., I just kept hearing banging and scratching on the door and outside of the chalet. It stopped around 2 a.m. Anyways, I went out to check the next day, and there were definitely footprints around, but because of the snow and rain, they were deep and partially melted, and I just couldn't tell how big they were or how recent either, really. Anyways, that spooked me out like crazy, and I just needed to share. Also, about 6 years ago, also while on my uncle's chalet, my brother and I encountered what we thought was a big and lanky dog again at night while walking around the area. I can elaborate on that more, but I'm on mobile and I'm in my car and feeling a little car sick. Experiences in Chicago's Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. Was reading various spooky stuff online one of those nights, and stumbled in here, felt like sharing. Not very active on Reddit, more of a browser, but I feel like others may appreciate this. So, Bachelor's Grove Cemetery is quite a well-known place here in the Chicago area, specifically south of the city. A very old and rather small cemetery that is seemingly forgotten, overgrown, gravestones, crumbling next to a large swamp, tons of paranormal sightings here all over the internet and books, etc. So, me and about 8 friends decided to go pay a visit to the cemetery one night. It was close to Halloween, when we were roughly in the 20 to 23 age range. None of us had been there before, so we figured we'd go in the spirit of Halloween, which was still like 2.5 weeks away, but whatever. When we arrived in 3 separate cars, we realized the parking lots for adjacent park grounds were all closed for the night, and of course, there's no lot for the cemetery. So, we went to a local 7-Eleven about 1.5 miles north of the cemetery. The lot there was empty, and the clerk in the store said he'd be fine with us parking in the back of the lot to head over to the cemetery on foot. So, it begins. We make the trek south. No sidewalks in this area, so we're walking along the side of the road. Surprisingly, not a single car passed the entire time we were walking. Everything was just quiet. We finally reached the opening to the cemetery, which is just a few yellow posts and a dainty chain draped across a couple darker posts with a small closed sign on it. Passing through this, you start down a long trail into the woods that's eclipsed by a canopy of trees across its length, blocking most of the already dim street lights. We got a pretty far distance into this trail when we came across a branching path that was basically pitch black and had a similar canopy made from trees and bushes, but was only about 5 feet high or so. Everyone was spooked, but I generally love anything creepy and exploring that sort of thing, So I ventured in as my friends made various comments about how much of a nope move that was. So I went through for maybe a minute or two and cleared the canopy, only to see a wooden porch of a house with a lantern on by the door. Figuring I may be trespassing on the property of the people who may tend to the cemetery or something, I turned back. Though we were technically trespassing in the cemetery anyways, I figured, don't push it. I told my friends it was nothing, and we moved along to the actual cemetery. And I mean, it was a really cool place. Amazing overgrown scenery next to the swamp, plenty of old gravestones, got tons of nighttime photos. Overall, great experience. We finally left, and were passed by what seemed like a dozen cars on the way back to ours, seemingly like we had finally entered back into civilization after our adventure. So, fast forward to the next day, going through the pictures finally, and I find one that looks like a subtle outline of a woman holding what appears to be a baby. Pretty psyched by this. It's not a clear, oh, that's a ghost type of picture, just a blur of white that roughly resembles the silhouette of a woman holding onto a baby, which I thought was kind of cool looking. I show it to my friends, who in turn show me their pictures, one of which was a headstone, which had nothing on it except the words, infant daughter. Toys scattered all over the headstone and on the ground from various visitors to the cemetery. We look it up, and it turns out a woman apparition that's been dubbed the Madonna is a common story among other people visiting the cemetery. They say it's a woman in white that appears while holding an infant or baby. Super spooked. Awesome. So, fast forward again, roughly 6 years later. The pictures taken were misplaced, and I have nothing to show for the visit, but me and my friends fondly talk about that night when chatting and anything spooky comes up in our conversations. My mother, who I told all of this to right after it happened, bought a haunted Chicago book. This is still about 6 years later on a typical day, with a list of multiple haunted places in the city, and what supposedly happens in those places. She's looking through the book while I'm watching TV, and all I hear is holy shit from her. I look up, and she's staring at me with the most shocked face, but most excited face I've ever seen. I bite and ask, "What'd you find?" She reads a portion about Bachelor's Grove Cemetery that describes one of the things people say that happens there, which is a farmhouse that appears for some, with a glowing light emanating from it. Evidently, the location varies, and sometimes it moves even farther from people as they approach it, and it ultimately vanishes upon exiting the cemetery. Some say that if you enter, you never come out. You know, the typical spooky story stuff. But my mom was freaking out because she remembered me mentioning that I had gone up to that house with a light and casually left, as not to get caught on the property. This is not a house that there's people just to tell scary, spooky stories about. Another tidbit about it is that there is no record of any houses being anywhere on the cemetery grounds, or even near it. I've been back once during the day, and there was no 5-foot path into the woods. No house anywhere around the cemetery. I thought the picture I got was pretty cool. But finding out that a house that I saw and talked about casually over the course of 6 years to various people turned out to not actually exist, that gives me the chills.